On August 14th, 2017, a woman walked into a house she had visited before. She never came out alive. Later that night, a burning car was found near some allotments. What police discovered inside would shock everyone. Years later in Salford, a man's life slowly fell apart. Someone knocked on his door, a knock he had heard many times. But this time was different. What started as threats turned into a nightmare of fear and violence. By the end of that year, police would find him tied up, hurt, and surrounded by weapons. Then, on December 14th, 2024, just after 2 a.m., two cars met on open ground at Eldon Lane. A teenage argument had grown out of control through the night. In less than 40 seconds, a father of three would be running for his life, falling just meters from safety. 3 different stories, 3 different years. Each one started quietly, but ended in terrible violence. This is what happened next, and how police found the truth. Welcome to Truth Unraveled. Let's begin. William McFall and Stephen Unwin came from different parts of the UK, but their stories were surprisingly similar. Both had killed before. Both had hurt elderly people. Both had tried to hide what they did. And both had been released from prison. In 1996, in County Down, Northern Ireland, William McFall was in his 20s when he attacked 86-year-old Martha Gilmore. He used a hammer during a robbery. The attack was brutal. He left her to die in her home and took her jewelry. McFall got a life sentence, but served only about 10 years. He was released on license in 2010. Stephen Unwin's crime was similar. On Christmas Day 1998, he targeted 73-year-old John Greenwell in Sunderland. He killed him for money. Then he used fire to try to destroy the evidence. Like McFall, he was released early. He walked free on life license in 2012. The two men met inside HMP's Swaleside, a high-security prison on the Isle of Sheppey. Court evidence later showed they became friends there. After getting out of prison, they stayed in touch through Facebook. To the outside world, they looked like changed men. They said they did maintenance work on rental properties to earn money. But the truth was darker. They got involved in crime again, including taking over cannabis farms to steal drugs or money. Their criminal records should have warned people. For Quyen's family, the most painful question was simple. How were two convicted murderers allowed to be released and work together again? But nobody stopped them, and the woman who would soon meet them had no idea about the danger they posed. Quyen Ngoc Nguyen was 28 years old. She had come to the UK from Vietnam years before, looking for a better life. She worked hard, took college courses, learned English, and found jobs in nail salons and property-related work within the Vietnamese community. Her friends and family said she was kind, organised, and always helped others. Her sister Quyen, sometimes called Gwen, talked about how their family believed Britain would give Quyen and her children a safer future. Quyen helped landlords find tenants, especially Vietnamese families who had just arrived in the UK. She connected property owners with workers and community members who needed places to live. Through this work, she met Stephen Unwin. He did maintenance jobs on flats rented to Vietnamese tenants. To Quyen, he seemed helpful and reliable, someone who could fix problems or handle paperwork quickly. Contacting him was normal for her. He was just another tradesman connected to the properties she managed. On the day she died, nothing seemed unusual. Quyen followed her normal routine, working, helping others, planning her week. She had no idea that Unwin and McFall were already talking about her finances and her access to properties. When she drove to Unwin's house that final time, she felt safe. She had been to that address before without any problems. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. But what was waiting inside would change everything. August 14th, 2017 started like any normal day for Quyen. By late afternoon, she was driving to Unwin's home in Shiny Row. She thought she was handling a routine property matter. A neighbour's CCTV camera captured her arrival. The footage showed her walking calmly toward the door. She looked relaxed. Once that door closed behind her, she would never leave alive. Inside the house, everything was different from the normal meeting she expected. What happened over the next 4 to 5 hours was later pieced together from forensic evidence, phone data, and digital records. Prosecutors explained that Quyen was held prisoner while both men tried to force her to give them bank PINs and financial information. During this time, Unwin took her bank cards and left the house several times to withdraw cash. CCTV cameras caught him going to ATMs to take out money, then returning to the house. On one trip out, cameras showed him buying a bottle of whiskey. Later, forensic tests found that same whiskey, suggesting it had been forced on Quyen. While she was held captive, she suffered terrible treatment and violent sexual assaults. The prosecution said the men had 2 goals: sexual violence and stealing money. They also knew they needed to silence her because she could identify them. Experts later described the relationship between the 2 men. Unwin was organized and controlled everything. McFall was unpredictable and violent, but followed along. By the time the violence reached its worst point, the decision had been made. Quyen was wrapped in a sheet. Her body was prepared to be moved. The men were ready to carry out their final plan. What happened next took the crime to a remote location where they thought all evidence would simply burn away. In the early hours of August 15th, 2017, the neighbour's CCTV recorded something horrifying. The front door opened. The 2 men came out carrying Quyen's body wrapped in a sheet. The footage showed no panic, no rush, just steady, practiced movements as they carried her to her Audi A4. They placed her in the back of the car. Then, McFall got into the driver's seat with Unwin. Investigators later traced their route using ANPR cameras, CCTV footage, and timeline evidence shown to the jury. The cars headed toward a remote track near allotments on the edge of Sunderland, a quiet place where they believed no one would see the fire they were about to start. What happened next became one of the most disturbing findings of the entire case. Forensic analysis suggested something horrific. Quyen was still alive when the car was set on fire. The pattern of burn injuries, the lack of smoke inhalation signs that would be expected after death, and the position of her body all pointed to the same awful conclusion. She was breathing when the flames started. People nearby reported seeing nothing unusual, only noticing the fire once it had already grown large. By the time emergency services reached the vehicle, flames had completely consumed it. The interior was destroyed, making quick answers impossible. But what stood out most was not the fire itself, but how the men acted afterward. They walked away calmly. There was no attempt to hide their movements. CCTV cameras caught them returning from the fire site to Unwin's house shortly after. They walked inside with the same calm pace seen when they carried her out. Each piece of evidence, the footage, the ANPR camera hits, the forensic burn patterns, built a minute-by-minute timeline that left little doubt about what had been planned and how deliberately it was carried out. And yet, even after the fire, their night was not over. What they did next showed a level of coldness that stunned detectives when the footage finally came to light. Investigators later said those hours were some of the most revealing in the entire case, not because of what was hidden, but because of what was done so openly and casually. Shortly after arriving back home, the pair cooked and ate curry. They carried on as though the violence that had just happened was nothing more than a minor interruption to their evening. It was this contrast between the brutality of the crime and the calmness that followed that prosecutors would later show to the jury. Their next movements were traced with exact precision. Phone data, CCTV, and ANPR captured them traveling to various cash machines using Quyen's bank cards to withdraw money. Around £1,000 was taken from her accounts. Withdrawals were made one after another until the cards were blocked. During this time, McFall took one of the most infamous photos in the case, a selfie taken inside Unwin's car. McFall was grinning into the camera while Unwin drove. The timing placed it shortly after they returned from the allotments and around the time of the ATM withdrawals. It was a moment that showed their complete indifference to what had just occurred. Forensic evidence built on these movements. DNA linked both men to items found in the house, including weapons that prosecutors said were used in the assaults. Clothing found on the property, including Marvel-branded underwear, carried DNA that tied them directly to the physical acts inside the house. Phone usage patterns, cell site data, and message logs added more detail, mapping their route and placing them exactly where investigators said they had been at every critical moment. But the evidence did not stop with their movements. The investigation widened fast, and the digital trail they left revealed far more than they ever intended to show. What began as a burned-out car at the edge of Sunderland quickly developed into one of the most carefully reconstructed murder timelines the region had seen. Once the vehicle was identified as Quyen's and her remains confirmed, detectives worked backwards through her last known movements. That process led them to Shiny Row. Detectives built their case piece by piece. They started with the neighbor's CCTV, which captured her arriving. Then her cell site data and ANPR data filled in the gaps. Once those core timings were confirmed, detectives moved quickly. The evidence already pointed toward Unwin's home. Officers planned a full search before any remaining traces could be lost. Inside the house, the forensic footprint was extensive. DNA recovered from contact points and from items established direct involvement from both men in what happened before her death. Their clothing carried more traces, fibers and bodily fluids, along with Unwin's digital activity and messages. Financial movements strengthened the chain of evidence. Combined, the material supported the prosecution's position that the men acted together throughout, not separately, not in panic, but in deliberate coordination. Both were arrested immediately. And yet, the most revealing moments came not from the evidence itself, but from how both men behaved when they were finally forced to face it in court. When the case finally reached Newcastle Crown Court, it unfolded across a long, detailed trial where every step of that night was examined. William McFall was disruptive from the start. His behavior swung between anger and defiance. He ranted in open court, swore, shouted at jurors, and frequently clashed with his own legal team. At times, he tried to paint himself as a man misled by Unwin, someone manipulated, someone pulled along by a force stronger than his own judgment. But every time he tried to change his image, another outburst destroyed the picture he was trying to create. Stephen Unwin, in contrast, presented himself as controlled and reformed. He spoke quietly, rarely reacted, and kept his tone measured. That picture shifted when letters exchanged between the men in custody were revealed. Written in Unwin's hand, they talked about sticking to the same story. They referenced what they called an ace card they believed could help them avoid conviction. The letters made clear that both men were trying to create a unified account and exploit what they thought were loopholes in joint enterprise law. When the verdicts were delivered, they reflected complete clarity. Both men were found guilty of murder. Unwin was additionally convicted of rape. Before sentences were passed, Quyen's family delivered impact statements that cut through all the legal language. Both men were given whole life orders, placing them among a small group of offenders in the UK whose crimes are deemed so severe that they will never be considered for release. And while this case had finally reached its conclusion, another would begin hundreds of miles away. One that unfolded not in a single night, but over the course of a year, leaving a different trail of fear and violence behind it. It began quietly, long before police understood the scale of what was unfolding. The victim was a man living alone. He was known to be vulnerable. And he was known, at least to the people who started visiting his doorstep, to hold significant amounts of cryptocurrency. His identity has not been made public in any police or court reporting, so for clarity in this account, we will call him simply Alex. That combination made him an ideal target, someone with assets that could be moved instantly and anonymously, and someone unlikely to fight back. What followed from January to November 2023 was not a single attack, but a slow, methodical campaign of intimidation that grew more violent with each encounter. The gang learned early that they could pressure him into transfers. The first warning came in January 2023, on a night that should have meant nothing. A simple knock at the door. But the moment Alex opened it, he understood the tone had changed. Scott Armstrong stood there, not to talk, but to demand. The threats began immediately. The clear expectation was that money would be transferred then and there. There was no disguise about the motive. They knew he held cryptocurrency, and they knew how quickly it could be moved. Under that pressure, frightened and unsure what might follow, he transferred money directly into an account controlled by Armstrong. It was the first extraction, and it set the pattern that would define the year. A short time later, still within that same month, the situation got worse. This time, David Povey arrived at the house with another man beside him. The tone shifted from intimidation to danger. One of them carried a knife, a visible message that the negotiations of earlier weeks were over. They pushed for more money, another transfer, another loss from the victim's digital holdings. Alex complied again, not because he could afford to, but because he believed that refusal would bring immediate violence. These early incidents introduced the key players, each fitting into a distinct role even at this early stage. By the end of the second incident, the group had tested their method and found it effective. By spring, the group realized they did not need to wait for him to open the door. They could force their way into his life whenever they wanted. By October 2023, the pattern of threats was working for the gang. But what happened at the Caddis Head flat marked a clear step up in violence. Alex was asked to go there with the idea that he needed to resolve yet another demand. He went because he felt he had no choice. The earlier incidents had already shown what the gang were capable of. When he arrived, any illusion of negotiation disappeared immediately. Gary Edwards dragged him inside, closing the door behind them and cutting off any route of escape. Once inside, the violence became more organized. Alex was tied using cables and rope. The restraints were tight enough to prevent any resistance. He was then forced into a cupboard where he was kept overnight, injured, frightened, and with no sense of how long he would be held. Officers later described the conditions in the flat as controlled and deliberate, not improvised, but prepared for intimidation and restraint. Across the hours that followed, the threats got worse. Alex was assaulted with machetes and bats, weapons that were later recovered by police when the flat was searched. One of the offenders, Quyen Ngoc, made it clear what would happen if he could not pay. He told Alex he would be killed if he did not comply. The message was simple. Every demand had to be met, and excuses were no longer acceptable. Pressed for immediate transfers, Alex tried to move cryptocurrency then and there. But when he explained he did not have enough access at that moment, the gang switched tactics. They forced partial transfers and told him he would have to complete the rest later. When they finally released him, it was not freedom in any real sense. It was conditional. He was expected to continue paying and expected to comply the moment they returned. And just weeks later, that control would tighten even further, leading to the abduction that finally brought the police directly into the center of the operation. Only days later, they returned to his home. This time, there was no pretense of negotiation. A bag was forced over his head. His arms were restrained. He was taken from the house before he had time to understand where he was being moved. When the covering was removed, he found himself in a flat on Egret Drive in Salford, a property the gang controlled and used as a base where victims could be kept away from public view. The injuries he already had were clear: burns, bruising, and patterned marks consistent with repeated assaults. Inside the flat, the layout confirmed the purpose of the space. Police later documented bed straps, cables, and ties, all positioned where someone could be held down or restrained. Weapons were also stored inside, including machetes previously linked to threats made during the extortion attempts. At some stage, Alex managed to get away from the flat. He slipped from their control long enough to reach a friend's house. It was a narrow moment of breathing space, but it did not last. No single report stated how he escaped, but somehow he was able to manage it. But that was not the peak of intimidation. It was only the point where the gang showed how determined they were to keep hold of him. On November 30th, they tracked him down again, forced entry, another bag over his head. He was thrown into a van and taken back into captivity before he had time to ask for help. The pattern was now unmistakable. Wherever he tried to hide, they would drag him back. Whatever distance he put between them, they would close it. When officers finally located him on December 2nd, 2023, inside the Egret Drive flat, the reality of the preceding weeks became clear. He was visibly terrified, physically weakened, and desperate for the situation to end. As police moved him out, he pleaded with them, asking to be taken with them, afraid the gang might return before he was fully removed from the building. But rescuing him was only the beginning. The evidence inside the flat revealed the scale of the operation the gang had been running all year. Across the rooms, officers recovered a full arsenal. The most serious find was a viable firearm, complete with a magazine loaded with 3 live rounds. Alongside it were an imitation firearm, an air pistol, a collection of knives, cleavers, and machetes. There were also several blunt weapons, including bats and a hammer. Each item reflected a pattern that had echoed through the victim's account. Restraint equipment was also found, ties, straps, and cables, confirming the flat's role as a place where victims could be held for long periods. DNA analysis provided another layer of clarity. Cigarette butts found inside the flat carried the DNA profiles of Carl Johnson and Luke Johnson, placing them directly within the environment used to detain the victim. A firearm recovered from the property held DNA attributed to Jonathan Nunes, linking him to the weapons used to enforce threats. Documents inside the flat further connected the address to Carl Johnson, tying occupancy, control, and responsibility to the same group of men already linked through violence. The digital evidence matched the physical findings. Cell site data mapped the movements of key members of the group. Phone communications revealed coordination between offenders, discussions about money, instructions, and planning around when to collect the victim or force additional payments. Together, the digital patterns showed that these incidents were not spontaneous. They were organized, pre-arranged, and repeatedly executed. With the evidence now fixed in place, officers moved quickly. The arrests followed soon after, bringing each member of the group into custody before the cycle could begin again. When the case reached Manchester Crown Court in December 2023, the scale of the operation finally came into full view. Jonathan Nunes received one of the heaviest terms, 20 years in prison. David Povey was also sentenced to 20 years. Luke Johnson received 13 years and 6 months. Gary Edwards was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months. Kane Gould was given 7 years and 5 months in jail. Carl Johnson received 3 years for his role in providing the environment. Scott Armstrong received 2 years and 4 months. While the sentences closed the chapter in court, the third case began in a very different setting. Open ground, 2 cars, and a feud spiraling toward tragedy. The path to the violence on December 14, 2024, did not begin that night. It began more than 2 years earlier, with a dispute that should have faded, but instead settled into something far more damaging. In August 2022, Cameron Lawson was in a local park when a fight broke out between his friend Marley Rolls and Jack Richardson. Before the confrontation, Rolls handed Lawson a bag containing several gold rings for safekeeping. Richardson arrived with associates. In the chaos that followed, Lawson was robbed of the bag. He reported it to police, but ultimately, as his father explained in court, chose not to press charges. He feared reprisals from the older, more dominant group. The decision ended the official inquiry, but it did not end the feeling that he had been humiliated. What followed over the next 2 years was a simmering resentment that never quite left him. By the late evening of December 13th, around 10 p.m., Lawson and Richardson crossed paths again at the Tesco car park in Tyndale Crescent. It was a chance meeting that immediately changed the night's direction as tensions rose. Rolls's Peugeot van arrived. From that van, a knife was passed into the glove box of Lawson's Focus. This detail was later confirmed in court. This was not the knife used in the fatal stabbing, but it showed how quickly weapons were introduced into what had supposedly been arranged as a one-on-one fist fight. From that point, the night became a long pursuit. Lawson drove around Shildon and Bishop Auckland, filming himself as he shouted abuse at Richardson, sending Snapchat messages that swung between bravado and anger. By 1 a.m., Lawson had joined up with 4 others: Connor Vint, Marley Rolls, Harry Brown, and a 17-year-old. They spent the next hour trying to pin down Richardson for the fight, agreeing on Eldon Lane as the meeting point. Then came the key moment. At 2:34 a.m., Lawson filmed himself driving with a knife resting in his lap, the knife he would use minutes later. Within minutes of returning to Eldon Lane, the clash that followed would unfold in less than 40 seconds, ending with a man running for his life. When both groups returned to Eldon Lane just after 2:40 a.m., the confrontation they had been circling around for hours finally happened. Up the slope of Millbank Terrace came Richardson's red Ford Focus carrying 3 men: Jack Richardson, the intended opponent, Craig York, and Jordan Hodgson, both 28 years old. Evidence later showed that Hodgson and York were armed. At least one knife was visible afterwards, and both carried African walking sticks, the same type used to attack the Vauxhall Astra. Moments later, as the red Focus reached the top, it collided with the Vauxhall Astra driven by Vint, one of Lawson's group. 2 hooded figures, York and Hodgson, jumped out and immediately began striking the Astra, targeting the passenger side where one of Lawson's associates sat trapped inside. In Lawson's account, he saw this from the driver's seat of his own white Focus. The knife was already resting in his lap. He said he stepped out, intending only to scare them off. But what happened next unraveled in fewer than 40 seconds. York turned toward Lawson, raising his stick. Lawson lunged 3 times. The first strike entered beneath the armpit. The second, the fatal wound, pierced his chest, traveling 65 millimeters into the right lung, damaging rib and cartilage. The third struck the groin. York's hands bore defensive wounds, showing he tried to block the blade. CCTV captured the moment York broke away, running down toward nearby houses. He collapsed outside the home of his cousin, Trevor Thompson, managing to call his name before falling. Neighbors rushed out, attempting CPR until emergency services arrived. Despite their efforts, York was pronounced dead at 3:38 a.m. But even as York lay dying, Lawson was already filming himself, creating the very evidence that would later anchor the case against him. The murder weapon was never recovered. Lawson admitted throwing it away during the drive that followed, but officers did recover a separate knife hidden in a bin carrying York's DNA, along with a balaclava also bearing his DNA. Neither were tied to the fatal stab wounds, but they confirmed weapons among Richardson's group. CCTV and ANPR mapped the vehicle's movements before and after the attack, matching the sequence reconstructed in court. The arrests came quickly. Sharp-eyed officers spotted Lawson's white Ford Focus returning to the South Church area soon after the stabbing. Lawson, Vint, and the 17-year-old were taken into custody with no resistance. Rolls and Brown were arrested days later. Pathology revealed more than 30 injuries on York, including the stab wounds and defensive cuts on his hands. CCTV from High Street later showed Hodgson carrying a knife, reinforcing the prosecution's view that Richardson's group was also armed. Ultimately, the jury acquitted all four co-accused of murder and manslaughter. Only Lawson, the one who inflicted the stab wounds, was convicted. At Teesside Crown Court, Lawson received detention during His Majesty's pleasure, the mandatory life sentence for a youth convicted of murder. The sentence. The judge began at 23 years, as Lawson had taken a knife to the scene, but reduced it to 20 due to his age, immaturity, and ADHD-related impulsivity. He accepted Lawson intended serious harm, not death, though filming the bloodied knife was an aggravating factor. With 295 days on remand deducted, the minimum term became 17 years and 70 days. What do you think about these cases and the sentences? Were the punishments fair? Could anything have been done to prevent these tragedies? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next episode of Truth Unraveled. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.